Hey guys, Pastor Sheldon here. I'm coming to you on Sunday morning, maybe if you're watching it on Sunday morning. I'm here in my office. I'm going to be posting these videos on YouTube every Sunday as kind of the youth Sunday experience. It's not in place of the worship service that our church is putting out, but it's in addition to, kind of like Sunday school or life groups might be on a normal Sunday when we're meeting together. This is going to be kind of the youth Sunday experience. Just going to be a quick 6, 7, 8 minute video going through a series that I'm calling Resisting the Enemy. So kind of to introduce this idea, I want to share a quote with you from Mike Rowe. He's famous for a couple different shows that he's done. Dirty Jobs is kind of the most famous one, but I really respect him and his words. And he shared these words a few days ago. He says, "Here we are, 5.5 million people from all over the world dealing with the exact same challenge, the exact same feelings, the exact same fears, all at the same time, more or less. Look at the enemy that we face, a faceless, genderless, heartless terrorist that wants to kill you and everyone you love. This thing doesn't care how we vote or how we think or who we are. It is our enemy, our common enemy." So while he's talking about the coronavirus that's keeping us from meeting together, I think that those words ring so true for what we know, what we as Christians know to be the true common enemy, and that is the devil, that is Satan. And this is kind of a topic that we don't like to talk about, but I'm hoping in these Sundays, however long that may be, that we have to be apart. To bring you some ways to maybe recognize how the enemy is at work in your life and how to resist it, how to resist the enemy. And so in the case of Satan and in the case of this coronavirus, enemies often breed more enemies. With the coronavirus, that is an enemy in itself, that as a virus, as a pandemic, is killing people around the world, is infecting people around the world, and that is tragic. But in our own lives, whether we take that seriously or not, we should be taking seriously the enemies that can come from that, the enemies of fear and anxiety and isolation and depression, whatever those enemies are that have come from this greater enemy. And so this enemy of Satan that we face, there are all sorts of enemies that come from him that are wrapped up in our daily lives, whether we notice it or not. So during this time, again, however long it may be, we're going to be looking at how we can turn to God in order to resist this enemy. So I want to share with you a couple verses from James chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. It says, "So humble yourselves before God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Come close to God, and God will come close to you. Wash your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, for your loyalty is divided between God and the world." I've seen a lot of memes recently that kind of talk about this verse in kind of a joking way. It talks about washing your hands, and that's just such a big deal these days as far as taking care of yourself and getting rid of whatever germs and virus may be around. But I think it is so true when we're talking about resisting the enemy, that when we come close to God, he comes close to us. When we purify ourselves, when we look to God to clean us, when we wash our proverbial hands, God is going to give us the strength to resist the enemy. So that's kind of just an overview of what this series will be for however long we have to be apart, for however long that we have these videos that I'll be recording on Sundays. But this week specifically, this Sunday, we're going to be talking about the presence of God and how the presence of God can help us to resist Satan, can help us to resist the devil. God's presence is kind of this abstract idea. It's not something tangible that we can feel, but I honestly believe that it is the foundation of our spiritual life, is noticing God's presence, noticing how God is at work in and through us. And so paying attention to and noticing God and his presence is central to our spiritual growth as individuals and as the community. Even though we may not be physically together, we are still a community of believers. And if we aren't noticing God's presence in our lives, how can we hope to grow? We'll just be stagnant. We'll be spiritually immature, like Paul talks about. And that's not what we want to be. And so we're going to be talking about noticing this presence, and as Brother Lawrence, who's a monk from the 1600s, a phrase that he used is practice the presence. So we're going to look a little bit about how we can practice the presence. So what exactly does that mean? What does it mean to practice the presence? I think that means that we practice having that awareness of God. And in our lives, we may not see as obvious as in this book. We may not see these great stories of how God is at work in the lives of his people. We may not see these stories of people raised from the dead or people healed of great diseases. We might not see that every day. But that doesn't mean that God is any less at work. It doesn't mean that God is any less involved in our lives. It doesn't mean that his presence is any further away from us. So, in noticing the presence of God, it helps us to resist the enemy. But we need to be practicing that presence. We need to be practicing how we notice God. A while back, I kind of had my first experience with what an anxiety attack is. And it was just a crazy culmination of stress about work and stress about school and stress about going on a long trip. And my heart just continued to beat faster and faster, and I couldn't get it to slow down, and I was just fidgety, and I could not calm down well into the night. And as I was able to realize that that's what this was, that this was an anxiety attack, I realized that this was the enemy attacking me, that through anxieties about these different areas of my life, the enemy was attacking me. And understanding God's presence in that time was just instrumental in helping me to calm down, helping me to have peace. Because when I am practicing the presence of God, I am resisting the enemy. I was praying to God throughout those hours in the night, 3, 4 in the morning, when I just could not calm down, when my heart could not slow down. As my mind was jumping to worst case scenarios. I could not calm down. But practicing the presence of God by saying, God, I know that this enemy is currently at work inside of me, but you are much greater. And asking God to help me to resist that enemy, my heart rate was able to slow down, and I was able to rest. And moving forward, there were times when my mind jumped back to that time and jumped back to that anxiety and that stress. But I just had to remember that God's presence was with me, and that God's presence was stronger than that enemy. And that helped me to calm, helped me to resist the enemy in that situation. So if you watched the video on Wednesday, Pastor Scott challenged us. He challenged us to be spending intentional time 3 days a week, just spending intentional time with God. And I want to give you a similar challenge, but it's also different. It's a challenge that is spending intentional time with God, but it's more so in recognition of how God's presence is in your life. Whatever that may be, whatever that may look like. It might look like reading scripture. It might look like praying. It might look like serving. It might just look like recognizing, hey, I have peace in this time of chaos. That is not my own doing. That is the presence of God. But at the same time, it's not just something that we happen into. We need to be intentionally becoming aware of that. We need to be intentionally focused on God at work in our lives. So I'm going to read a couple verses from Mark chapter 6. This is just right after Jesus has done the miracle of feeding all of those people with the fish and loaves that the boy had. He's just fed all of these people. This great miracle has just happened in his ministry. And the very next couple of verses here, Mark 6:45 and 46, it says, immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and head across the lake to Bethsaida, while he sent the people home. After telling everyone goodbye, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. Then a little bit later, in verse 50, it says, but Jesus spoke to them at once. Don't be afraid, he said. Take courage, I am here. This is God's presence in the lives of his disciples. First of all, he goes away to pray. He goes away to spend time with God, to be aware of God's presence in his own life. Then he comes back and he's with the disciples and he walks on the water to them, and they're afraid. But he says, don't be afraid, take courage, for I am here. So in this time of chaos with all the coronavirus and all of the ways that the enemy is shutting down your school and shutting down church and shutting down all of these ways that we live in community with one another and the regular rhythms of our lives, we need to recognize that that is the enemy at work. And while we may not be able to stop the enemy as far as what that means for us being with one another and social closening, while we may not be able to do that, we need to recognize that God is telling us, do not be afraid, take courage, for I am here. His presence is with you. His presence is with all of us. And when we recognize that, as we recognize that in the coming days and weeks ahead, we are going to be able to resist the enemy. Whatever that enemy looks like, whether it is a large-scale understanding of who Satan is and a large-scale understanding of the coronavirus, whatever that may be, those enemies that come up in our lives with anxiety and fear, doubt, isolation, depression, whatever it may be, do not be afraid. Take courage because God is with you. So I challenge you to be recognizing God's presence in your daily lives ahead. I love you guys. I miss being with you, but I want to stay connected. So reach out if you need it.